Last warning, get on the ground, now!
I am on my own property. Articulate the crime, officer, right now.
You're refusing lawful orders!
There is no lawful order without reasonable suspicion. Put the weapon away.
Turn around, you're under arrest!
I am not resisting. This is an unlawful arrest on my curtilage.
The young officer whose name tag read Miller didn't care about the Constitution. He cared about authority. And he didn't like the tone of the woman standing above him. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't screaming. She was speaking with the icy, terrifying calm of a woman who had spent 30 years destroying arguments in federal courtrooms. But Officer Miller didn't know that. He didn't know that the woman in the gardening hat and cardigan was Eleanor Vance. He didn't know she was the section chief for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He didn't know that she had personally overseen the consent decrees of 3 major police departments in the last decade. All he saw was a 58-year-old black woman in an upscale neighborhood where he believed she didn't belong, refusing to do what she was told. Last warning. Miller shouted, his hand dropping to the taser on his belt. Get on the ground. I am not getting on the ground. I am standing on my curtilage. You have no jurisdiction to order me about on my own private property without reasonable suspicion of a crime. Articulate the crime, officer. Right now. Articulate it. Before we watch this situation spiral into an absolute legal nightmare for this department, I need you to do something. Stop what you're doing and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, your city, your state. And if you believe that a person's home is their castle and that police overreach needs to be stopped, hit that subscribe button right now. You are not going to believe the level of arrogance you are about to witness. This story is going to make your blood boil, but you need to see how it ends. Eleanor Vance had worked hard for this piece. She handled the toughest prosecution cases in Washington, D.C. She dealt with hate crimes, systemic corruption, and human trafficking. Her weekends in this quiet, leafy suburb were her sanctuary. She had lived in the colonial-style house for 12 years. Her neighbors knew her. The mailman knew her. But Officer Kyle Miller, 28 years old and transferred to this precinct only 3 months ago, did not know her. And he wasn't interested in learning. He was interested in domination. The dispatch call had been vague, a suspicious person report from a neighbor 2 streets over who claimed to see someone lurking on porches. That was it. No description of a crime, no broken windows, just a bias-based call about a person looking out of place. Miller had driven down the street, seen Eleanor standing on her porch examining a hanging fern, and decided she was the suspect. "You're under arrest for trespassing and disorderly conduct," Miller yelled, unholstering his taser and pointing it directly at her chest. Eleanor didn't flinch. She looked down at the red laser dot on her cardigan. She looked back up at Miller. "You are pointing a less lethal weapon at a senior federal official on her own property." "You have qualified immunity only insofar as your actions are reasonable. This is not reasonable. Put that weapon away before you commit a felony." To understand the gravity of what was happening, we have to rewind just 20 minutes. It was a perfect Saturday morning, the kind of morning people work 40 years to enjoy. Eleanor had woken up early, made a pot of French press coffee, and put on her old gardening clothes, a comfortable pair of linen slacks, and a loose sweater. She had been pruning the hydrangeas. She had waved to Mr. Henderson across the street as he walked his golden retriever. It was the definition of suburban tranquility. She had just walked up the steps to sit on her porch swing and check her emails from the Attorney General's office when the cruiser screeched to a halt in front of her driveway. Now that peace was shattered. "I need to see some ID," Miller barked, stepping onto the first step of her walkway. "You need to prove you live here." "I don't need to prove anything to you," Eleanor said, her voice projecting clearly. She knew the law better than she knew her own children's birthdays. "This is a consensual encounter until you establish reasonable suspicion. You cannot demand identification from a citizen on their private property without specific articulable facts that a crime has occurred, is occurring, or is about to occur." Hybel v. 6th Judicial District Court of Nevada. Look it up. Miller paused. He clearly hadn't expected a case citation, but his ego was already too involved to back down. He felt the eyes of the neighborhood on him. A car slowed down as it passed. A woman across the street had stopped raking leaves. "We had a report of a suspicious person trying to break into homes," Miller lied. He was exaggerating the dispatch call to justify his aggression. "You fit the description." "What description?" Eleanor asked. "Did the caller describe a 58-year-old woman in gardening clogs pruning hydrangeas? Or did they just say black person? Because if you are detaining me based on a generalized description without corroborating behavior, you are engaging in racial profiling. That is a violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause." "Stop with the lawyer talk," Miller snapped. He took another step up the walkway. "You're resisting an investigation. That's a crime." "Exercising my rights is not resistance. It is citizenship," Eleanor retorted. She remained seated on the swing, her coffee mug still in her hand. "I am telling you for the last time, leave my property. You are not welcome here. You are trespassing." Miller's face turned a shade of red that clashed with his uniform. He was used to fear. He was used to people pleading, crying, or running. He didn't know what to do with a woman who looked at him like he was a misbehaving toddler. "I'm not leaving until I identify you," Miller said, crossing the invisible line of the curtilage, the area immediately surrounding the home that enjoys the same privacy protections as the house itself. "You just crossed the legal threshold," Eleanor said, pulling her phone from her pocket. She didn't call 911. She opened the camera app. "I am placing you on notice. You are violating clearly established law. There is no emergency here. There is no hot pursuit. You have no warrant. If you touch me, you will be facing a Title 18 Section 242 investigation for deprivation of rights under color of law." Miller froze for a second. The specific code citation rattled him. But then he looked across the street. A neighbor, a young man named David, had come out and was filming with his phone. Miller felt he had to win. He couldn't let a suspect lecture him in public. "Put the phone down," Miller ordered. "No," Eleanor said. "I have a First Amendment right to record public officials in the course of their duties. You are 0 for 3 on the Constitution, officer. Do you want to go for 4? The air in the neighborhood seemed to stand still. The birds had stopped singing, replaced by the crackle of Miller's police radio and the heavy breathing of a man who was in way over his head. Officer Miller made a choice. It was the decision that would define the rest of his life. He decided that his authority was more important than the law. He convinced himself that she was bluffing. She was probably just some squatter or a housekeeper with an attitude who had watched too many episodes of Law and Order. There was no way this woman was actually important. Important people didn't wear muddy gardening shoes. "That's it," Miller gritted out. "You're under arrest." He holstered his taser and stormed up the porch stairs. The wood creaked under his heavy boots. "I am not resisting," Eleanor stated loudly. Her voice directed not at Miller, but at the neighbor David, who was filming from the sidewalk. "I am passively complying with an unlawful order to avoid physical injury. Witness that I am offering no physical resistance." Miller grabbed her arm roughly, jerking her up from the swing. The coffee mug in her other hand tilted, spilling hot liquid onto the porch floorboards. "Turn around." Miller shoved her toward the porch railing. "I am turning," Eleanor said calmly. "You are using excessive force on a compliant subject. That is a Fourth Amendment seizure violation." Miller grabbed her wrists and twisted them behind her back. He pulled the handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click-click echoed off the siding of the house. It was a sound that usually signaled the end of a suspect's freedom. For Eleanor Vance, it signaled the beginning of a crusade. "You are hurting my shoulder," Eleanor said, her face pressed against the white column of her own porch. "I have a previous rotator cuff injury. I am informing you of this medical condition now. If you continue to hyperextend my arm, you are liable for damages." "Stop talking," Miller panted. He was sweating now. He double-locked the cuffs, squeezing them tighter than necessary. "You're done. You can tell it to the judge." "Oh, I certainly will," Eleanor whispered. "I'll tell it to the chief judge. I'll tell it to the Internal Affairs Bureau. I'll tell it to the federal grand jury." Miller dragged her down the stairs. Eleanor stumbled slightly but regained her footing. She walked with her head high. She didn't look at the ground. She looked straight at David, the neighbor filming. "David," she called out clearly, "please email that video to my work address. Use the DOJ server." Miller stopped. "Who are you talking to?" "My witness," Eleanor said. Miller shoved her toward the back of his patrol car. He opened the door and pushed her inside. The back of the cruiser was cramped, smelling of stale sweat and vinyl cleaner. It was a humiliation designed to break people. Eleanor Vance sat awkwardly, her hands pinned behind her back, her shoulder throbbing. But her mind was crystal clear. She began to memorize the timeline. 10:14 a.m. Officer arrival. 10:17 a.m. Trespass on curtilage. 10:19 a.m. Unlawful arrest. Miller got into the front seat. He adjusted his mirror to look at her. He expected to see tears. He expected begging. "If you had just shown me your ID, none of this would have happened," he said, trying to justify his actions to himself. Eleanor met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Officer, if you had known the law, you wouldn't be about to lose your pension." Miller laughed nervously. He put the car in drive and pulled away from the house, leaving the spilled coffee drying on the porch of the woman who was about to dismantle his entire department. The drive to the precinct took 15 minutes. It was 15 minutes of silence. Miller turned on the radio, trying to drown out the gnawing feeling in his gut. He was running the scenario over in his head, coming up with the language he would use in his report. Subject was belligerent, refused lawful orders, appeared to be under the influence, fear for officer safety. The standard buzzwords bad cops use to cover their tracks. Eleanor sat in the back, closing her eyes. She wasn't sleeping. She was composing the opening paragraph of her civil rights complaint. She was drafting the subpoena list. She was thinking about the Monell claim, the legal doctrine that would allow her to sue the city itself for failing to train this officer properly. They pulled into the sally port of the precinct. The garage door rumbled shut behind them, sealing them in the concrete belly of the station. Miller got out and opened the back door. "Let's go," he said. He grabbed her arm again, parading her through the intake area. Other officers looked up. They saw a woman who looked like their mothers or their aunts, dressed in nice clothes, handcuffed. A few eyebrows went up. Arresting a senior citizen from the wealthy district for disorderly conduct wasn't exactly the collar of the month. Miller brought her to the booking desk. Sergeant Thomas Kowalski was on duty. Kowalski was 56 years old, a veteran who had seen it all. He was 2 years from retirement and just wanted a quiet shift. He looked over the high counter at Miller, then at Eleanor. "What do we have here, Miller?" Kowalski asked, his tone bored. "Refusal to identify trespassing, disorderly resisting," Miller rattled off. "Found her on a porch over on Elm Street. Neighbors called in a suspicious person." Kowalski looked at Eleanor. He looked at her manicured hands, her expensive haircut, the way she stood, not slumped but waiting. "Ma'am, were you trespassing?" Kowalski asked. "I was drinking coffee at my own home, Sergeant," Eleanor said. Her voice was calm, authoritative. "Officer Miller decided that a black woman in zip code 20854 must be a criminal." Miller slammed his hand on the counter. "She refused to show ID. She was belligerent." "I asserted my Fourth Amendment rights," Eleanor corrected. "And now I would like my handcuffs removed. They are cutting off circulation." Kowalski sighed. "Uncuff her, Miller. We're in a secure facility." Miller hesitated, then undid the cuffs. Eleanor brought her hands forward, rubbing her wrists. There were deep red indentations. She looked at them, then held them up for the camera in the corner of the room. "Empty your pockets, please," Kowalski said. "Standard procedure." Eleanor reached into her slacks. She pulled out her keys. Then she pulled out a slim leather wallet. She placed it on the counter. "My identification is in the center slot," she said. Kowalski picked up the wallet. He opened it. The first thing he saw was a driver's license. Eleanor Vance, 412 Elm Street. "Miller," Kowalski said slowly, looking at the license and then at the officer. "This is her house. The address matches." Well, she didn't show it to me," Miller stammered. "Keep looking, Sergeant," Eleanor said softly. "Behind the license." Kowalski flipped the flap. He froze. There behind a protective plastic sheet was a federal credential. It featured the Department of Justice seal. It said, United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Below that, it said Section Chief. And below that, a card with a gold stripe that read, U.S. Attorney General's Office, Priority Access. Kowalski stared at the badge. He looked at the photo. He looked at Eleanor. The color drained out of his face so fast he looked like he was about to faint. He knew what the Civil Rights Division did. They were the ones who came in and tore corrupt police departments apart. They were the feds that every cop had nightmares about. And this rookie had just dragged one of their bosses in handcuffs for gardening. The silence in the booking room was absolute. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Officer Miller, sensing the shift in atmosphere, leaned over to look at the wallet. "What is it?" Miller asked. Kowalski closed the wallet slowly, treating it like it was made of radioactive glass. He looked at Miller with a mixture of pity and rage. "You idiot," Kowalski whispered. "You absolute moron." "What?" Miller stepped back. Kowalski walked around the desk. He didn't look at Miller. He walked straight to Eleanor. "Ms. Vance, ma'am, I am Sergeant Kowalski. I need to apologize immediately. There has been a terrible misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Sergeant," Eleanor said, her voice hard as steel. "It was a false arrest based on racial profiling and a gross ignorance of the law. Is the watch commander in?" "Yes, ma'am. Lieutenant Henderson is in his office." "Get him, now." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Kowalski turned to Miller. "Go sit in the break room. Don't speak to anyone. Don't touch your body camera. Don't write anything. Just sit there and pray." Miller, looking confused and suddenly very small, walked away. Kowalski picked up the phone and dialed an extension. "Lieutenant, you need to come down here, immediately." "No, sir. It's a situation, with a capital S." 2 minutes later, Lieutenant Henderson burst through the double doors. He was a man who prided himself on keeping a tight ship. He saw Eleanor standing by the booking desk, rubbing her wrists. He saw his sergeant looking pale. "Ms. Vance?" Henderson asked, approaching her with his hands out, palms up. "I'm Lieutenant Henderson. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. We can get you a ride home right now. We'll expunge the arrest record immediately. Just a rookie making a mistake." Eleanor looked at him. She didn't smile. She didn't accept the handshake. "Lieutenant, you are not going to expunge anything yet," she said. "You are going to process this arrest. You are going to generate a booking number. You are going to take my mugshot." Henderson blinked. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand. We want to let you go. No charges." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Eleanor said. "You want to bury this. You want to make it go away so there is no paper trail. But that's not how the law works. Your officer arrested me. He deprived me of my liberty. If you fail to document that you are falsifying records, I want everything documented. I want the body camera footage downloaded and preserved with a chain of custody log. I want the dispatch logs. I want the name of the caller." She stepped closer to the lieutenant. She was 5'4", but she towered over him. "You see, Lieutenant, I'm not just a victim today. I am the evidence, and I am going to make sure that every single second of this encounter is preserved for the federal lawsuit I am filing on Monday morning. Now fingerprint me." Henderson looked at Kowalski. There was no way out. They couldn't refuse to process someone they had arrested. That would be another policy violation. "Process her," Henderson said, his voice defeating. "And someone get me the chief on the phone, on a Saturday." Eleanor Vance left the station 40 minutes later. She walked out the front door holding her release papers. She didn't take the ride from the police. She called her husband, a retired surgeon, who picked her up in their sedan. He was furious, but Eleanor was calm. She was in work mode. As soon as she got home, back to the porch where it all started, she sat down at her computer. She didn't even change out of her gardening clothes. She sent 3 emails. The first was to the United States Attorney for the district. The second was to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. The third was to the best civil rights litigator in private practice in the state, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who Eleanor had mentored years ago. By Monday morning, the precinct was under siege. The lawsuit, Vance v. Miller and the city, was filed at 9:00 a.m. sharp. It was a masterpiece of legal writing. It didn't just claim emotional distress. It laid out a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing. Eleanor had used her connections to pull the data. It turned out Officer Miller had a habit. In his 3 months, he had stopped black motorists and pedestrians at a rate 4 times higher than his peers. He had 5 complaints for rudeness that had been dismissed by Lieutenant Henderson. The suspicious person caller was identified as Mrs. Gable, a notorious neighborhood busybody who had called the police on delivery drivers, meter readers, and kids selling lemonade. The police knew she was a nuisance caller, yet Miller had treated her vague, biased report as gospel truth without verifying a single fact. The internal affairs investigation wasn't optional this time. With the DOJ looking over their shoulder, the department had to bring in outside investigators. They interviewed the neighbors. David, the young man who filmed the arrest, provided the video. The video went viral, of course. Not because Eleanor posted it, she didn't need to, but because it was public record in the court filing. The sight of Officer Miller twisting the arm of a 58-year-old woman on her own porch while she calmly cited Supreme Court cases became the most shared clip on the internet. Commenters were stunned. "She schooled him," one wrote. "He picked the wrong one," said another. But for Eleanor, it wasn't about internet fame. It was about the principle. The city attorney took one look at the video, then one look at Eleanor's resume, and told the mayor, "Write the check." There was no defense. None. Miller had violated clearly established law. He had no qualified immunity. But Eleanor refused the first settlement offer, and the second. "I don't want a non-disclosure agreement," she told the city's lawyers during a deposition. "I want a consent decree." She wanted systemic change. She demanded that the department rewrite its policies on suspicious person calls. She demanded mandatory training on the Fourth Amendment and implicit bias led by outside experts. She demanded that officer disciplinary records be made more transparent. And she demanded Officer Miller's badge. 6 months later, the results came in. The investigation sustained all charges against Officer Kyle Miller. Unlawful arrest, excessive force, biased policing, and conduct unbecoming. He was terminated. Because of the severity of the civil rights violation, the state licensing board revoked his certification. He would never be a police officer again. The city settled the lawsuit for $1.2 million. It was one of the largest settlements for a single arrest in the state's history. Eleanor didn't keep a dime. She created the Vance Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal representation for homeowners who had been harassed by police in their own neighborhoods. The police chief was forced into early retirement. Lieutenant Henderson was demoted for failing to supervise his rookie officers. The department was placed under a monitoring agreement requiring them to report stop and frisk data to the state for the next 5 years. It was a Tuesday afternoon, almost a year later. The weather was turning crisp, the leaves changing color. Eleanor Vance sat on her porch swing. The hydrangeas were blooming beautifully. She held a cup of coffee in her hand, the same mug she had held that day. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the street. It was a new officer, a young woman. As she passed Eleanor's house, she slowed down. She didn't stop to harass. She gave a respectful nod, a wave of acknowledgement, and kept driving. Eleanor took a sip of her coffee. The neighborhood was quiet. The birds were singing. She had won, but she knew the fight wasn't over. She knew that for every Eleanor Vance with a law degree and federal credentials, there were thousands of people who didn't know the words curtilage or reasonable suspicion. There were thousands who got cuffed and took the plea deal because they were scared. She had fought for them. She had used her power, her privilege, and her pain to carve out a little more space for justice in this world. Justice isn't just about punishing the bad guys. It's about protecting the peace of the innocent. It's about the right to sit on your own porch in your own home and breathe free air without fear. Officer Miller had tried to take her dignity. Instead, he had given her a platform. He tried to order her off her porch, but he ended up proving why she and everyone else had the right to stay right there. What do you think? Was the punishment for Officer Miller enough? Or should he have faced criminal charges for what he did? And what would you do if an officer ordered you off your own property? Drop a comment below and let's get a conversation started. If this story moved you, please share it. We need to look out for each other. Until next time, stay safe. Know your rights and never let anyone push you off your porch.
Put your hands behind your back. Now.
Officer, you are making a mistake. I live here.
Get on the ground.
I am not getting on the ground in my own driveway. I'm asking you to lower your voice and listen.
Sir, stop resisting.
I am not resisting. I purchased this property in 1998. If you touch me, you will regret it.
I don't care who you are. Turn around.
This is going to end your...
Put your hands behind your back, now. Officer, you are making a mistake. I live here. Get on the ground. I am not getting on the ground in my own driveway. I'm asking you to lower your voice and listen. Sir, stop resisting. I am not resisting. I am standing on the property I purchased in 1998. If you touch me, you will regret it. I don't care who you are. Turn around. Officer Derek Vance had been patrolling the immaculate streets of Oak Creek for 7 years when he decided that his authority superseded the United States Constitution. He was 32 years old, a man who wore his badge like a shield against accountability, convinced that his instincts were sharper than the law. On a bright Wednesday morning under the clear blue sky of a wealthy suburb, he received a dispatch call regarding a suspicious individual surveying a property. The individual was Marcus Thorne, a 52-year-old Deputy Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Thorne was standing on his own lawn holding a tape measure and a notepad planning a renovation for a new perimeter fence. What Officer Vance did next, ignoring property rights, dismissing a federal official's calm assertions, and handcuffing a homeowner in front of his neighbors, would become a defining moment in the national conversation about who is allowed to feel safe in their own home. Before we get into the details of how this officer's career imploded, tell us where you're watching from. If you believe that homeownership should be a sanctuary for everyone regardless of skin color, hit that subscribe button. We are building a community dedicated to truth and accountability. Officer Derek Vance had a personnel file that read like a warning label the department refused to read. In his 7 years with the force, he had accumulated 9 official complaints. 6 of them involved aggressive posturing or excessive detainment of minority citizens in high-value neighborhoods. Vance was what the department quietly referred to as a proactive officer, a euphemism for someone who viewed every person of color in a wealthy zip code as a potential suspect until proven otherwise. His supervisors had noted on 3 separate performance reviews that Vance struggled with distinguishing between community presence and community harassment. Yet he remained on the street. He was the type of officer who believed that fear was the currency of respect. If a citizen wasn't afraid of him, Vance assumed they were challenging him. This mindset was a ticking time bomb, and on that Wednesday morning in Oak Creek, the timer finally hit 0. Oak Creek is the kind of neighborhood where the lawns are manicured with surgical precision and the homeowners association bylaws are thicker than the Bible. It is a place of quiet wealth, 3-car garages, and an unspoken agreement that order must be maintained at all costs. Marcus Thorne had lived in the neighborhood for 22 years. He was one of the first black professionals to buy into the development in the late 90s. At 52 years old, Thorne was a man of immense stature, both physically and professionally. He stood 6'2" with graying temples and a posture that spoke of decades in high-level federal meetings. As a deputy assistant secretary for HUD, Thorne didn't just understand housing law, he helped write it. He had spent the last 30 years of his life dismantling the remnants of redlining and fighting for equitable housing practices across the nation. He was a man who operated in a world of precise legal language, federal statutes, and absolute procedure. That morning, Thorne was on a scheduled day off. He was dressed in casual but neat attire, khaki slacks, a tucked-in polo shirt, and loafers. He held a retractable tape measure and a clipboard. He was measuring the setback distance from the curb to his side yard, preparing an application for the HOA to replace his aging cedar fence with wrought iron. He was completely absorbed in his task, noting down measurements, checking angles. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He wasn't looking at anyone. He was simply a homeowner taking care of his asset. But to one set of eyes watching from across the street, Marcus Thorne wasn't a neighbor. He was a threat. Bryce Miller was 34 years old and the newly elected president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. He was a man who took his volunteer position with the gravity of a national security advisor. Miller worked in mid-level logistics management, but in Oak Creek, he was the king of the cul-de-sac. He spent his days working from home, often sitting by his front window, monitoring the street for violations, unapproved, paint colors, grass that was half an inch too long, or cars parked on the street for more than 4 hours. Miller had lived in the neighborhood for only 2 years, yet he felt a deep, proprietary need to protect the community. When he looked out his window and saw a black man walking back and forth along the edge of the Thorne property, measuring the ground and taking notes, Miller didn't see a neighbor he hadn't formally met yet. He saw a scout. In Miller's mind, fueled by internet forums and paranoid neighborhood watch apps, strangers measuring property lines were criminals casing houses for burglary. It never occurred to him that the man might own the house. It never occurred to him to walk across the street and ask, "Can I help you?" Instead, Miller watched for 5 minutes, his suspicion hardening into certainty. He saw Thorne step onto the grass, measure the distance to a fire hydrant, and write something down. That was enough. Miller picked up his phone. He didn't call the neighbor. He called 911. 911, what is your emergency? I need a unit at 4100 Oakview Lane. There's a suspicious individual casing a property. Is the individual armed? Is he threatening anyone? No, not yet. But he's walking around the yard measuring things. He's looking in the windows. He's taking notes. He doesn't belong here. I think he's planning a break-in. Can you describe the individual? African-American male, maybe 50s. He's acting like he owns the place, but I know the owner's on this street and I haven't seen him. This was a lie. Miller didn't know Marcus Thorne because Thorne traveled extensively for work and kept to himself, but Miller felt justified in his ignorance. Okay, sir. We'll send a unit to check it out. The dispatch went out. Suspicious subject 4100 Oakview Lane. Casing property. Reporting party state subject is measuring windows and walking perimeter. Officer Derek Vance was 3 blocks away. When he heard the call, his mind immediately snapped into a predetermined narrative. In Vance's experience, or rather in his biased worldview, people who didn't look like they belonged in Oak Creek usually didn't. He didn't hear man measuring for a fence. He heard burglar preparing a hit. He hit his lights, not the siren, wanting to catch the suspect by surprise. Vance pulled his cruiser up to the curb at 4100 Oakview Lane at 10:42 a.m. He didn't park politely. He angled the nose of the car aggressively toward the driveway, blocking the exit path, a tactical move designed to prevent flight. He stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his utility belt, his hand resting instinctively near his holster. He saw Thorne standing near the garage, writing on his clipboard. Thorne looked up, saw the police car, and initially gave a small, polite nod, assuming the officer was there for something else. He went back to writing. This indifference infuriated Vance. In his mind, a suspect should be nervous. A suspect should run. The fact that Thorne ignored him was read not as innocence, but as arrogance. Vance walked up the driveway, his stride long and aggressive. "Hey, you dropped the clipboard." Thorne paused, looking up over his reading glasses. He didn't drop the clipboard. He held it to his chest. "Excuse me, officer. Can I help you?" "I said drop the clipboard and step away from the garage. We have a report of suspicious activity." Thorne frowned, his brow furrowing. "Suspicious activity? I'm measuring my property line for a fence application. Who called you?" "I ask the questions here," Vance snapped, closing the distance. He was now within 5 feet of Thorne. "Do you have identification?" "My identification is inside the house," Thorne said calmly, gesturing toward the front door. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am the owner of this property. If you give me a moment, I can go inside and get my wallet." "You're not going anywhere," Vance barked, stepping in front of Thorne to block the path to the door. "You're not going inside to grab a weapon. You're staying right here." This is the moment where training is supposed to kick in. A seasoned officer would look at the man's attire, his demeanor, the clipboard, the tape measure, and the well-kept house and deduce that this was a misunderstanding. But Vance wasn't looking for a misunderstanding. He was looking for a conquest. "Officer," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the tone he used in congressional hearings. "You are making a significant assumption. I am a Deputy Assistant Secretary for the federal government. This is my home. You are currently trespassing on private property without a warrant or probable cause." Vance laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Deputy Secretary, yeah, and I'm the mayor. Stop the lies. I've got a witness across the street says you've been casing this joint for 20 minutes. "I haven't been casing anything. I have been measuring. Look at the notes." Thorne extended the clipboard. Vance slapped the clipboard out of Thorne's hand. It clattered onto the concrete driveway. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. "I told you to put it down. Now, turn around and put your hands behind your back." Thorne's eyes went cold. He looked at the clipboard on the ground, then back at the young officer. "You just assaulted a federal official. I want your badge number and I want a supervisor here immediately." "You want a supervisor? You're getting a cell." Vance grabbed Thorne's wrist. Thorne didn't pull away, but he stiffened. "Do not touch me. I am complying with your verbal commands to stand still, but I do not consent to a search or seizure." "Stop resisting," Vance yelled loud enough for the neighbors to hear. He twisted Thorne's arm behind his back with unnecessary force, leveraging the older man's shoulder joint to a painful angle. Thorne grimaced but didn't cry out. He knew that any movement could be interpreted as aggression. He had seen the files. He knew the statistics. He knew that being right wouldn't stop a bullet. "I am not resisting," Thorne said through gritted teeth. "I am standing still. You are hurting my shoulder. Shut up." Vance shoved Thorne forward, slamming his chest against the hood of the patrol car. The metal was hot from the morning sun. Vance kicked Thorne's legs apart. "Spread 'em." Across the street, Bryce Miller was watching from his window. He felt a surge of validation. "See," he told himself. "The cops are arresting him. I was right. He must have had a warrant or drugs on him." Miller pulled out his phone and started recording, thinking he was documenting a victory for the neighborhood watch. He had no idea he was filming the evidence that would destroy his own reputation. Vance pulled the handcuffs from his belt. He didn't use the standard technique. He ratcheted them tight, the metal biting into Thorne's wrists. "You're under arrest for loitering, trespassing, and resisting a peace officer." Trespassing. Thorne repeated, his face pressed against the hot car hood. "On my own property. You are going to lose your badge, son. I promise you that." "Yeah, keep talking. Add threatening an officer to the list." Vance hauled Thorne upright and spun him around. At this point, a neighbor 2 doors down, Mrs. Gable, a retired schoolteacher who had known Thorne for 15 years, came running out onto her porch. "Officer, stop! That's Mr. Thorne." "He lives there," she screamed. Vance looked at her, then back at Thorne. For a split second, doubt flickered in his eyes. But his ego was too large to allow for a reverse gear. He had already committed. To stop now would be to admit he was wrong, and Derek Vance did not admit he was wrong. "Back inside, ma'am, police business," Vance yelled at her. "He lives there," Mrs. Gable shouted again, pulling out her own phone to record. "You are arresting the homeowner." "I'll sort it out at the station," Vance muttered to himself. He shoved Thorne into the back of the cruiser. "Watch your head." He didn't actually help. He pushed Thorne's head down roughly as he forced him into the cramped plastic seat. Inside the car, the air was stagnant and smelled of industrial cleaner and stale sweat. Marcus Thorne sat awkwardly, his hands numb behind his back. He took a deep breath, forcing his heart rate to slow. Panic was the enemy. Documentation was the ally. He began to mentally catalog every violation. Fourth Amendment violation, unreasonable seizure. First Amendment violation, retaliation for speech. Title 18. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. He looked at the dashboard clock, 10:51 a.m. He memorized the officer's nameplate. D. Vance. He looked out the window and saw his neighbors gathering phones raised. Good. The world would see this. Vance climbed into the driver's seat. He was breathing heavy, adrenaline spiking. He felt powerful. He keyed the radio. "Dispatch 1 in custody. Transporting to precinct. Subject was non-compliant." "Copy that, 1 Adam 12. The drive to the precinct was a 10-minute blur of suburban streets. Vance glanced in the rearview mirror. "You comfortable back there, Mr. Secretary?" He sneered. Thorne met his eyes in the mirror. His expression was one of absolute terrifying calm. "My title is Deputy Assistant Secretary, and I suggest you enjoy this drive, Officer Vance. It will be the last time you drive a patrol car." Vance laughed again, but it sounded thinner this time. The man in the back seat didn't look like the usual suspects Vance brought in. He didn't look scared. He looked like a man who was already writing the opening statement of a lawsuit in his head. They arrived at the precinct. Vance pulled into the sally port, the heavy garage door clanking shut behind them. He hauled Thorne out of the car, marching him through the secure doors and into the booking area. The precinct was busy. Phones ringing, officers typing reports, the hum of fluorescent lights. At the intake desk sat Sergeant Tom Higgins. Higgins was 58 years old, a 30-year veteran who was counting the days to retirement. He had seen everything. He knew every cop in the precinct, and he knew which ones were good police and which ones were liabilities. He had been warning the lieutenant about Vance for 2 years. Vance pushed Thorne toward the counter. "Trespassing, resisting failure to ID." Higgins looked up. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at Vance, sweating and agitated. Then he looked at Marcus Thorne. He saw the expensive loafers. He saw the quality of the polo shirt. He saw the way the man held himself, even in handcuffs, chin up, eyes clear, dignity intact. And he saw the fury radiating off him like heat waves. "Trespassing?" Higgins asked, his voice skeptical. "Where 4100 Oakview Lane," Vance said. "Guy was casing the place, refused to leave, got aggressive." Higgins paused. He knew Oakview Lane. That was the high-end district. "And you are?" Higgins asked Thorne. Thorne spoke clearly, his voice carrying through the room. My name is Marcus Thorne. I reside at 4100 Oakview Lane. I have lived there for 22 years. I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. My credentials are in my back pocket, which this officer refused to let me retrieve. The room went silent. The typing stopped. A detective at a nearby desk looked up. Higgins stared at Vance. "Vance, did you check his ID?" "He wouldn't show it. He tried to run inside." "I offered to retrieve it," Thorne corrected. "He assaulted me instead." Higgins stood up. "Vance, back away." "Sarge, he's full of it." "I said back away." Higgins barked. He came around the desk. He walked up to Thorne. "Sir, with your permission, I'm going to check your wallet." "You have my permission," Thorne said. Higgins reached into Thorne's back pocket. He pulled out a slim leather wallet. He opened it. The first thing he saw was a Washington, D.C. driver's license listing the address 4100 Oakview Lane. The second thing he saw was a silver and gold badge and a federal identification card. United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. Office of the Secretary, Marcus Thorne. Higgins felt a cold pit open in his stomach. This wasn't just a bad arrest. This was a career-ending, city-bankrupting disaster. He looked at the ID. He looked at Thorne. He looked at Vance. "Vance," Higgins said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Give me your keys." "What, Sarge? It's a fake ID, look at it." "Give me the keys to the cuffs, now!" Higgins roared. Vance fumbled for his keys, his face draining of color. He handed them over. Higgins unlocked the handcuffs. Thorne rubbed his wrists. There were deep red indentations where the metal had cut into the skin. "Mr. Secretary," Higgins said, "I need to apologize immediately. There are no words." Thorne didn't look at Higgins. He looked at Vance. "I want that man's badge number, his supervisor's name, and I want to speak to the chief of police. Now." "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." Higgins turned to the room. "Get the chief. Someone get the chief down here." He turned to Vance, his voice dropping to a whisper that was scarier than a shout. "Go to the break room. Sit down. Don't speak to anyone. Don't touch your phone. You just arrested a federal housing official for standing in his own driveway. You are done." Vance walked away, his legs feeling like lead. He was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. But the machine of justice was already turning, and it was turning against him. While Thorne was being ushered into the captain's office and offered water and ice for his wrists, the video footage was already making its way online. Mrs. Gable, the neighbor, had sent her video to her son, who posted it to Twitter. Bryce Miller's video, which he had foolishly uploaded to the neighborhood Facebook group with the caption, "Finally cleaning up the streets," was ripped and reposted. The internet moves faster than internal affairs. Within 2 hours, the headlines were everywhere. Black homeowner handcuffed in driveway. HUD official arrested for measuring fence. Neighbor calls cops on federal agent. The irony was suffocating. Marcus Thorne, a man who had dedicated his life to ensuring fair housing for all Americans, had been racially profiled in the home he had owned for 2 decades. The lawsuit was filed 3 days later. It was a masterclass in civil litigation. Thorne hired one of the top civil rights firms in the country, but he directed the strategy himself. The suit named the city, the police department officer, Derek Vance, the Homeowners Association, and Bryce Miller personally. The charges against Vance were blistering: false arrest, excessive force battery, violation of civil rights, malicious prosecution. The charges against the HOA and Miller were equally severe: discriminatory harassment, abuse of process, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Thorne didn't just want money. He wanted policy change. He wanted Vance's badge. He wanted Miller's resignation. The discovery phase was brutal for the department. Vance's history of complaints was laid bare. The internal emails where supervisors joked about his aggressive style were subpoenaed. The body cam footage was released, and it was damning. It showed Thorne's calmness and Vance's escalating aggression. It showed the clipboard being slapped away. It showed the moment Vance refused to look at the ID. The most damaging piece of evidence, however, was the 911 call from Bryce Miller. The jury and the public heard the bias dripping from his voice. "He doesn't belong here," acting like he owns the place. In a deposition, Thorne's lawyer asked Miller, "Mr. Miller, what exactly about Mr. Thorne's behavior was suspicious? Was it the tape measure or was it his skin color?" Miller stuttered, sweated, and claimed he was just vigilant. But the video of him watching from the window, safe and smug while a man was handcuffed, told a different story. Officer Derek Vance was fired 4 weeks after the incident. The chief of police, facing a Department of Justice inquiry, threw the book at him. Vance was stripped of his pension eligibility and decertified, meaning he could never work in law enforcement again in the state. The city settled the lawsuit for $6 million, one of the largest payouts in the department's history. As part of the settlement, the police force was required to implement a mandatory duty to verify policy officers could not arrest a person for trespassing on a residential property without first verifying ownership records or allowing the person to produce proof of residency, barring an immediate violent threat. Bryce Miller didn't get off lightly either. The HOA's insurance provider settled with Thorne for an undisclosed but significant sum, and the insurance rates for the neighborhood skyrocketed. The neighbors, furious at the financial hit and the bad publicity, turned on Miller. He was unanimously voted off the HOA board. A petition circulated to remove him from the neighborhood entirely, though it had no legal standing. Socially, however, he was exiled. No one waved to him. No one invited him to block parties. He eventually sold his house at a loss and moved 2 towns over. 6 months later, Marcus Thorne stood in his driveway again. The new wrought iron fence was installed elegant and strong. He was watering his hydrangeas. The physical bruises on his wrists had faded, but the memory was etched into his psyche. He watched a police car drive slowly down the street. It wasn't Vance. It was a new officer, a rookie. The cruiser slowed as it passed Thorne's house. The officer looked at Thorne. Thorne looked back. The officer gave a respectful wave and kept driving. It was a small gesture, but it wasn't enough. Thorne knew that for every high-profile victory like his, there were 1,000 quiet tragedies. He had the badge, the title, the money, and the knowledge to fight back. Most people didn't. What does it say about our society that a man can achieve the highest levels of government service, can buy a home in the best neighborhood, can follow every rule and still end up in handcuffs because one man with a badge and one neighbor with a phone decided he didn't fit the picture? Marcus Thorne won his case, but he lost his sense of safety. He learned that in America, you can own the deed to the land, but you can't always own the peace that should come with it. Justice was served, yes. Vance is gone. Miller is disgraced. The bank account is full. But when Marcus Thorne hears a siren now, his pulse still quickens. And that is a theft that no settlement check can repay. We have to ask ourselves, why are we still policing boundaries instead of building bridges? Why is the default assumption for a black man in a nice neighborhood criminal instead of neighbor? If this story made you think, if it made you angry, let's turn that emotion into action. Share this video. Talk about it. Hold your local officials accountable. Do you think homeowners should have more legal protection against biased 911 calls? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, take care of each other.